The emergency HOA meeting at the Elmswood Estates Community Center was already raging by the time I walked in. At the front of the room stood Nancy Bellows, our self-appointed neighborhood monarch, gripping her prized wooden spoon like it was a judge's gavel. Her face had turned a dramatic shade of purple, veins bulging in her neck like a map of fury. She slammed that spoon onto the folding table so hard that poor Mrs. Henderson's coffee leaped out of its cup. "Glenn Mathers must join our association immediately!" Nancy shrieked, her voice slicing through the air and into frequencies high enough to make dogs 3 blocks away start howling. "He's been living in our community for 6 months, breathing our air, using our roads, enjoying our property values without paying a single cent in dues." I rose slowly, savoring the moment I'd been waiting weeks to unleash. The manila envelope in my hand felt heavier than it should have, stuffed with 5 years of paperwork and 1 glorious property survey. "Actually, Nancy," I said, letting my voice carry across the stunned room, "you've been living on my land for the past 5 years. The silence that followed was poetry. Nancy's wooden spoon slipped from her grip and clattered onto the floor. Board member Tom Granger whispered something that definitely didn't belong in a public meeting. And Nancy's face drained from royal purple to paper white so fast I thought, she might faint. Let me rewind a bit so you understand how we reached this. Perfect moment of suburban justice. My name's Glenn Mathers. I'm 50 years old, a civil engineer by trade, and I thought I'd found my retirement paradise when I inherited 10 acres of wooded land in Pine Ridge from my late Uncle Harold. It was a slice of peace at the edge of what used to be farmland, now surrounded by cookie-cutter subdivisions and strip malls. But my corner remained untouched, a quiet refuge of towering pines and wandering deer trails. As someone who's spent decades dealing with blueprints, city codes, and construction chaos, I value order, especially when it comes to property lines. After 30 years in the field, I just wanted silence and space. So I built a modest 2,000-square-foot home on the eastern edge of my land, tucked away for privacy, but still close enough. To the main road. Across that road sat Elmswood Estates, a cluster of 47 identical beige houses that looked like they'd been squeezed from the same suburban mold. And reigning over that bland empire was none other than Nancy Bellows, a woman who dressed like she'd mugged a real estate agent in the 90s and made it her permanent wardrobe. Her navy blazers had shoulder pads that could deflect arrows. Her pencil skirts looked painted on, and her helmet of hairspray could have taken down a small drone. Nancy had elected herself HOA president through what residents described as a suspiciously smooth election process, one where she was the only candidate, and half the ballots somehow bore her handwriting. Since then, she ruled that the HOA was like a private kingdom, cranking out new rules faster than anyone could keep up. In just a few years, the HOA bylaws had ballooned from a tidy 12 pages to something resembling a phone book, dictating everything from the height of your mailbox to the exact shade of beige acceptable for your front door. I had barely unpacked my boxes when Nancy made her grand debut on my property. She strutted up my gravel, driveway in sensible heels, clutching her clipboard like it was a badge of honor, part real estate agent, part traffic cop, all attitude. "Mr. Mathers," she announced, skipping any pretense of a greeting. "I'm Nancy Bellows, president of the Elmswood Estates Homeowners Association. I'm here to collect your initial membership fee of $200 plus 6 months of back dues for the construction period." I set down the box I was carrying and gave her my most professional frown. "I'm sorry, but there's been a mistake. I'm not part of your HOA. This property isn't in Elmswood Estates." Nancy's left eye twitched, something I would later learn was her Karen override mode activating. She began flipping through her clipboard with the urgency of someone cutting the red wire on a bomb. "Nonsense," she said. "You're clearly within our community impact zone. Article 4, Section C of our updated bylaws states that any property sharing a visual corridor with member homes must comply with association standards." "Visual corridor?" I asked, genuinely intrigued by this latest stretch of legal imagination. "If we can see you," she replied flatly, "you affect us. Therefore, you're subject to our governance." She tapped her pen against the clipboard. "Also, those birdhouses need to come down immediately. They're unapproved models and clash with our earth tone palette. My late uncle handcrafted the birdhouses she was referring to, simple wooden homes that had sheltered generations of bluebirds. My jaw tightened, but I kept my voice even. "Mrs. Bellows," I said, "I appreciate your enthusiasm for community standards, but I own this land outright. It's not part of your HOA, and I have no intention of joining one. Have a good day." Nancy's face cycled through several shades before settling on a fiery salmon hue of outrage. She thrust a paper at me. "This is your first warning. Failure to comply will result in fines, liens, and restricted access to community resources." "What community resources?" I asked, genuinely baffled. "The roads, Mr. Mathers. We maintain the roads." "You mean the county road that my taxes pay for?" She huffed, spun on her heel, and clacked her way down my driveway, muttering about difficult newcomers and property value threats. That was only the beginning. Over the next few months, Nancy's campaign went from a petty annoyance to full-blown harassment. I started receiving official-looking notices accusing me of everything from excessive gravel accumulation to unapproved wildlife encouragement after she spotted deer wandering across my property. She actually fined me $300 for maintaining a non-conforming natural habitat. The letters came weekly, each one more absurd than the last. She cited me for having the wrong type of grass. Mine was native prairie grass that required no mowing. Claimed my solar panels caused aggressive glare, and even issued a warning that my morning coffee on the porch violated community sunrise meditation standards. Each time, I replied with the same calm typed response. "I am not a member of your HOA. This property is not within your jurisdiction. Please cease correspondence." But Nancy didn't believe in boundaries, legal or otherwise. One morning, I woke to the unmistakable growl of a lawnmower outside. I stepped out to find Nancy herself mowing a 20-foot strip of grass along the road, on my side of the property line. When I confronted her, she straightened up, hands on her hips, and said proudly, "This area has been designated a community green belt. It must meet HOA standards." "You can't just declare part of my property yours," I said, struggling to keep my temper. "It's not yours anymore," she replied with that signature smug smile. "It's a shared community asset." "Article 7, subsection 9, Nancy declared triumphantly, still revving the mower like she was auditioning for Fast and Furious HOA edition. "It clearly states that any unmaintained land adjacent to HOA property can be claimed for community beautification." I stared at her in disbelief. "You can't just make up laws, Nancy." "I don't make them up," she said smugly, giving the mower another dramatic pull. "I interpret them for the greater good." That was enough. I turned, walked back inside, and made 2 phone calls, one to my lawyer and another to my old friend Jake Morrison, a professional surveyor I'd worked with back in my engineering days. If Nancy wanted a property war, she'd just declared it on the wrong man, because what Nancy didn't know was that I wasn't just any civil engineer. I specialized in land development, 15 years of dealing with property disputes, right-of-way battles, and city mapping errors. I could read a survey map like most people read a takeout menu, and from the first day I reviewed my uncle's old documents. Something about Nancy's corner lot hadn't added up. Jake showed up the following week. His truck loaded with equipment, GPS units, and a grin that said he smelled trouble brewing. We spent the entire day out there, taking precise measurements, matching them against the original 1990s plat maps, and cross-referencing everything with the county's official land records. By sunset, Jake's grin had widened into something downright mischievous. "Glenn," he said, tapping his tablet. "Tell me you're seeing what I'm seeing." I looked over his shoulder at the data overlay. "That's a 30-foot discrepancy on the eastern boundary." "Not just any 30 feet, Jake said with a laugh. "That 30 feet includes Ms. Bellows' corner lot, her house, her herb garden, and that fancy gazebo she uses for her HOA meetings. All of it is sitting on your land." Turns out the developer of Elmswood Estates had made a surveying error back in 1993. The boundary lines had been drawn wrong and nobody had ever noticed. Houses were built, the HOA formed, and life went on, right on top of my uncle's property. Uncle Harold, bless him, had known about it. In fact, buried in his old papers, he'd left a note written in his trademark dry humor. Let them think what they want, until they become a problem. Well, Nancy had become a very big problem. I spent the next month preparing. Jake drafted certified survey documents confirming the error. I gathered county records, the original land grants, and every single piece of evidence I could find. I organized all of Nancy's letters, her fake fines, her trespassing, and her so-called Greenbelt mowing project. I even hired a real estate attorney to double-check everything. By the end, my case was ironclad. Then Nancy made her fatal mistake. She called an emergency HOA meeting. The topic, printed in bold across the flyers she taped to every front door in Elmswood Estates, addressing the Glenn Mathers problem. The agenda was a masterpiece of paranoia. Enforcing compliance through legal action, protecting our community from non-conforming neighbors, and restoring HOA integrity. That was my cue, which brings us right back to that glorious afternoon in the community center. Nancy's wooden spoon lying forgotten on the floor, her face cycling through colors like a broken slot machine. That's impossible, she finally sputtered. I've lived here for 15 years. This is my property. I have a deed. Yes, I said smoothly, pulling out my packet of documents. You have a deed for a property that was plotted incorrectly. According to the original land grant and the corrected survey, your eastern boundary actually ends 30 feet west of where you think it does. I spread the maps out on the folding table. The room filled with gasps and whispered disbelief. People leaned in to look, their eyes darting between the maps and Nancy Tom Granger, the same board, member who'd always laughed. A little too loud at Nancy's jokes, suddenly looked like someone had unplugged his soul. This is ridiculous, Nancy screeched. You can't just walk in here with fake documents and try to steal my home. I'm not stealing anything, I said calmly. I'm simply correcting a mistake that's been on record for 27 years. You, however, have been using my land for 5 of those years without permission or payment. This is harassment, she cried, pointing a trembling finger at me. This, I countered, is accountability. Nancy puffed up like an angry balloon. This is exactly why we need strict HOA enforcement. People like you think you can waltz in and destroy our community. Before I could reply, a calm voice spoke from the back of the room. Actually, it said, I think Mr. Mathers has a point. Heads turned. Walking forward from the crowd was Dennis Palmer, a retired judge who lived 3 doors down from Nancy. He picked up the documents and studied them in silence. These appear to be legitimate county records, he said finally. If there was a surveying error, Mr. Mathers would indeed have grounds for a boundary dispute claim. Dennis! Nancy gasped, her voice cracking. You're on the board. You're supposed to support the HOA. I support the law, Dennis replied evenly. And if your home is sitting on land that isn't legally yours, that's a matter for the courts, not the HOA. Nancy's face went through another full rainbow cycle. White, red, purple, and back again. This is a conspiracy, she shouted. You're all jealous of my leadership. I've maintained property values. I've kept out the riffraff. You've harassed a man who was never under your jurisdiction. I cut in, my patience finally gone. And now you're going to face the consequences. I reached into my envelope and pulled out another document. This, I said, sliding it onto the table, is a formal notice of trespass and a demand for 5 years of back rent for the use of my land. The crowd murmured. Given the square footage and market rates, I continued, that comes to about $2,000 per month. That's $24,000 a year. Someone in the back started doing the math out loud. 5 years. That's over $100,000. $120,000 to be exact, I confirmed. Of course, I'm open to alternatives. Nancy's fingers tightened on the table edge until her knuckles went white. What kind of alternatives? She hissed through clenched teeth. Option 1, I said evenly. You buy the land your house sits on for its current market value. That's $97,000, the crowd gasped. Nancy's left eye twitched so violently I half expected it to spin. Option 2, I went on. You sign a 5-year lease, $800 per month with strict conditions. What conditions? She demanded, her voice now low and dangerous. "First," I said, savoring the moment, "you immediately cease all HOA enforcement actions against my property. Second," I continued, "you'll acknowledge in writing that my land is not, and has never been, under your HOA's jurisdiction. Third, you'll remove every mention of my property from your bylaws and community records. And fourth," I paused, letting the silence hang in the air, "you'll keep a sign on your property visible from the street that says, 'No HOA activity permitted for the duration of the lease.'" You could have heard a pin drop. The room was so quiet it felt like even Nancy's hairspray was cracking under the pressure. "This is extortion," she hissed through clenched teeth. "No," Dennis Palmer interjected calmly. "This is a property owner exercising his legal rights, rights that exist because you, Nancy, failed to do your due diligence before expanding your HOA's authority to properties you never had a claim to." Nancy's face twisted. "I'll sue," she screeched, spittle flying. "I'll take you to court. Please do," I cut in. "I have 5 years of records proving your harassment, your trespassing, and your attempts to collect fraudulent fees you had no legal right to demand." Then I pulled out one final document, a thick folder containing every violation notice she'd ever sent me, every fake fine, every threatening letter. "By my count, you've tried to fine me over $18,000 for violations on land you don't own. That's not a clerical error, Nancy. That's criminal fraud." The room fell completely silent except for Nancy's heavy, shallow breathing. One by one, the board members shifted away from her like she was radioactive. Even Tom Granger got up and moved to the back of the room. "You have 1 week to decide," I said, gathering my papers. "Purchase, lease, or I'll see you in court. Your choice." Nancy, of course, chose none of the above. In what can only be described as a spectacular display of denial and entitlement, she spent the next week scrambling to rally her dwindling supporters, insisting I'd fabricated the entire survey. She even hired her nephew, who claimed to be a paralegal but actually worked at a print shop, to draft a so-called legal response. It was 30 pages of nonsense, full of made-up laws and fake citations, something that read more like sovereign citizen fan fiction than an actual defense. She titled it, "Counter Notice of Rightful Ownership and HOA Supremacy." In it, she claimed HOA law superseded county records, that continuous use established ownership regardless of deeds, and that I was guilty of maliciously undermining community harmony. And because Nancy never knew when to stop, she even tried to stage a protest, plastering flyers all over Elmswood Estates calling for residents to stand against property theft. Exactly 3 people showed up. Nancy, her sister Donna, who didn't even live there, and Mrs. Patterson, who thought it was a protest against the new cell tower and left when she realized her mistake. So, I did exactly what I said I'd do. I took her to court. The case landed. Before Judge Patricia Blackwood, a no-nonsense veteran of property law with zero tolerance for what she called suburban theatrics. The hearing was set for a Tuesday morning in September. Nancy showed up dressed like she was, attending a presidential inauguration, complete, with an enormous 1980s hat perched on her head. She'd hired a real lawyer this time, a jittery young man named Bradley who looked like he'd rather vanish than sit beside her. Throughout the proceedings, Nancy kept tugging on his sleeve, whispering furiously in his ear. I almost felt bad for the guy. Almost. My attorney, Sandra Chen, presented our case with brutal precision, original land grant surveys from the 90s showing the HOA boundary error, a new survey confirming the actual property lines, 5 years of unauthorized land use, and documentation of fraudulent fines. It was like watching someone construct a skyscraper of evidence while Nancy's reputation was the foundation crumbling beneath it. Bradley tried to fight back, mumbling about adverse possession and community standards, but Judge Blackwood wasn't having it. "Mr. Bradley," she said, lowering her glasses, "are you seriously arguing that an HOA's imaginary rules override state property law?" "Well, Your Honor, my client believes the established community standards—" "Your client believes a lot of things," the judge cut in sharply. "But belief doesn't move property lines. Mr. Mathers, do you have the original survey?" Sandra handed over the documents. The judge studied them silently while Nancy fidgeted so much that her hat pin came loose. Finally, Judge Blackwood looked up. "Mrs. Bellows, not only have you been occupying Mr. Mathers's land without permission, but you've harassed him for refusing to join an organization he was never required to join. You've attempted to collect money you had no right to demand, and you've wasted this court's time with your frivolous claims." Nancy bolted upright, forcing her lawyer to steady her. "Your Honor, I was protecting property values." "Maintaining standards! Without the HOA, this neighborhood would fall apart." "Sit down, Mrs. Bellows," Judge Blackwood said coldly. "The only chaos I see is the one you've created, through your arrogance and ignorance of the law." Her ruling was swift and brutal. Nancy owed me $37,000 for 5 years of unauthorized land use. The survey showed she'd encroached on nearly 1/3 of an acre. She was given 60 days to either purchase the land at market value or sign a lease. The fraudulent fines were dismissed outright, and she was ordered to pay my $8,000 legal fees. But the best part came next. Furthermore, Judge Blackwood added, given the evidence of harassment and fraudulent behavior, I'm referring this case to the district attorney's office for review of potential criminal charges. Bradley went pale. Nancy made a sound somewhere between a gasp and a deflating balloon. "Your Honor," Bradley stammered, "surely that's not necessary. Attempting to collect $18,000 in fake fines is fraud, Mr. Bradley," the judge replied. "Your client is lucky Mr. Mathers only pursued civil action." And with that, Nancy fainted, right there in the courtroom. Her hat flew off, revealing that her perfect blonde coif was actually a partial wig, which also went flying. 2 bailiffs and 1 mortified lawyer had to help her up. The fallout was immediate. Within a week, everyone in Elmswood Estates knew what had happened. An emergency HOA meeting was called, but this time Nancy wasn't leading it. Dennis Palmer ran the show, and the first order of business was a vote of no confidence. The result, 38-2. The only yes votes for Nancy came from herself and Tom Grange, who quickly changed his once he saw which way the wind was blowing. Nancy was officially removed from the HOA board. All her self-appointed titles, Director of Community Compliance, Aesthetic Standard Supervisor, and whatever else she'd made up, were dissolved. The bloated bylaws were trimmed down from a phone book-sized monster to a lean 15 pages. Then came the criminal investigation. Nancy was charged with fraud and extortion. She eventually pled guilty to reduced charges, earning 2 years probation, 300 hours of community service, and a $5,000 fine. The judge even added a special condition. Her community service could not be performed for a homeowners as association. When Nancy stood before the court to hear her sentence, the transformation was complete. The defiant queen of the HOA was gone. Her shoulders sagged, her back hunched, and the sharp arrogance in her eyes faded to quiet defeat. For the first time since I'd met her, she said nothing. No speeches about property values. No mentions of bylaws or community harmony. Just silence and the heavy weight of consequences she'd built for herself.